This episode of the EV Resource Podcast is brought to you by Titan Auto and Tire. Titan has some of the very few independent auto repair shops in Central Virginia that are qualified to work on EVs and hybrids. And from hybrids to Hummers, they fix everything. For more information and to schedule an appointment for your vehicle, go to TitanAutoTire.com. Coming up this week,
as it improves and gets to a critical point where it is undeniable that it's stopping accidents and saving lives, regulators will mandate that some sort of level 2+ solution is required.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to episode 156 of the EV Resource Podcast. I'm Zach Hurst, and each week I bring you the latest EV news, information, and interviews with industry experts. This episode, I have the honor and privilege of speaking with one of the leading experts and analysts in the automotive industry. In our conversation, we talk about Tesla, touch on the recent announcements by Ford and GM to adopt the NACS connector, and explore the impact of FSD, and really dive into what robo-taxis, fully autonomous vehicles, what they will mean for the future of the automotive industry. This was easily one of the most fun and enlightening conversations I've had, and I'm so excited to share it with you. So let's get right to it, and let me introduce to you all RBC Capital Markets lead equity analyst of Global Autos, Tom Narayan. Tom, I want to thank you for joining me on the EV Resource Podcast. This is an absolute honor and pleasure to have you with me. I don't know of any other, at least analyst that I've seen that's out there that, to me, it seems like you have an idea of Tesla and what they're all about way better than a lot of other people. So I'm excited to talk Tesla with Tom. But of course, before we get to the awesome conversation we're about to have, Tom, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I like that. Talking Tesla with Tom could be a cool report series. I might have to steal that from you.
It's yours. You can have
it. I'm RBC's global autos analyst. I spent the past 4 years in Europe as RBC's European analyst. So I got to step up, and now I get to cover the good old US of A. You notice I have an American accent, so kind of coming back home and covering global autos. And, you know, my perspective was actually coming outside of autos, which I think has helped me. I come from the media industry and covering things like Comcast and Netflix and those types of companies. So that industry went through a complete transformation, you know, with Netflix and streaming and all of that, disintermediating traditional media. And I feel like this is what's happening with autos, with electrification really coming to, you know, full force. And interestingly, I feel like Tesla is kind of like Netflix coming in like a bulldozer, and legacy companies in the media industry, they all became streamers at the end of the day, and some of them survived and some of them are doing well. And I feel like the same thing has happened here with autos. You've had Tesla come in, really lead the charge on electrification, and force the legacy guys to really get their act together. Tesla's called everything right. Battery prices came down. I think the auto industry was caught up in kind of, you know, business as usual. And now they're forced to innovate. And it's actually going to be better for the auto industry at the end of the day as battery prices come down and costs come down. It'll be a better product as well. So I see a lot of corollaries to what I did in the past in the media space to what's happening now in the auto industry.
Yeah, and I think having somewhat of, initially anyway, an outside perspective does give you a lot to kind of look more at the bigger picture, and you're not kind of in the trenches, as it were. You can get kind of blind to things that you see over and over and over again.
Yeah,
I have said that we all have a front row seat to what, at least from my point of view, seems to be one of the greatest technological turnover and change. And I don't know that we're going to see anything like this electrification of transportation that is on a global scale such a massive impact on humanity as a whole. And I know we're going to get into talking about some of your predictions and what you expect will happen as a result of this transition and some of the other things that are going on. Kind of focusing on Tesla themselves, I think it's safe to say that Tesla has been the big catalyst for this. I mean, the auto industry as a whole wouldn't be pushed as strongly towards electric vehicles if it were not for Tesla. What is it about this company that hasn't even really been around for very long? How is it that they are influencing the entire industry so dramatically?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing. And I think it's just that reason. The fact that they are new is why they're able to do it. Not have dealerships, not advertise. You know, how much of the car cost when you buy a car actually goes to dealership? How much of it goes in just advertising? You know, taking those things out and just, I don't think a lot of the ideas that have come out of Tesla are anything that that nobody's ever thought of. But it's just that these are such entrenched 100-year-old companies in some cases. And in Europe, for example, labor interests are so powerful. Some cases, the government owns equity stakes in these companies. So doing anything innovative is just impossible. And also there's protectionism that happens. And so all of these things, Tesla's been able to come in and kind of upend the whole system. And electrification, as you mentioned, yeah, you're right. I think it's like the first step in a couple of steps that are going to be transformational for our lifetimes. I think because of electrification, it allows for the next big thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is autonomy. And for Tesla, they're looking at things from a clean sheet perspective. If we were to build a society, how would we do it? Well, for example, fossil fuels. If an alien looked down at a car, they would say, "Oh, what an interesting heating machine this thing is." You know what I mean? It's 40% efficiency, right?
Yes.
Most energy. I think Elon said on his Analyst Day that only 25% of the actual fossil fuel is used for motion. It's crazy, right? If you think about it. And so electrification is just, it was always inevitable. I think he got the timing. They got the timing perfectly right. And it takes somebody just taking a big bet, which is what they did, right? It was $2,000 per kilowatt hour when he kind of went headlong into it, while the rest of the industry was kind of not really doing it, as aggressively. And it takes somebody looking at it from a clean sheet perspective and taking a gutsy bet and getting the timing right. So some of it is luck. Okay, I definitely has to play a role, just like anything does, but I have to give credit to taking that gutsy bet and just looking at things kind of clean sheet perspective. How would I build a society? How would I rebuild this industry?
Sure. And of course, Tesla has taken on the most powerful industries or technologies where you've got Tesla essentially against the oil industry, some of the most valuable and most powerful companies in the world. And the auto industry, which, like you were saying, is so entrenched in many different areas of the world that they're influencing policy for local, state level, or even national governments. And we've seen that play out here in the States many times, where there are still states that will not allow Tesla to actually sell their vehicles in that state. The ironic one that I always like to point to is Texas, which Tesla is now set up in Texas, and they're still not allowed to actually deliver vehicles in the state. So they have really been pushing and are still pushing against massive backlash. But over the last, we'll call it 3.5, 4 weeks, I think we're starting to see a shift in the way that, at least here in the United States, the automakers are looking at Tesla. As most of my audience should know by now, GM and Ford have both announced that they are adopting Tesla's connector standard. Well, as they call it, a standard. It's not quite a standard yet, but they're going to adopt that. And that, I think, is really just the first domino to fall in a massive shift in the auto industry. But I think it really will extend much further than just what connector a vehicle has on it or what charging station they can use. I think that this kind of opens the door maybe to Tesla creating other partnerships with companies that historically have really struggled from a software aspect. That's where Tesla, I think, excels better than anybody else. So with your experience What do you think the chances are that we're going to see a lot of announcements, maybe over the next 5 years, that Tesla starts to license some of their software? And we can even get into the autonomy and kind of let this lead there with like the FSD or autopilot software. Do you think we're going to see more partnerships between Tesla and who have been historically their competition?
Yes, absolutely. 100% yes. This is really what it's all about. And I do think this was the plan all along. You really saw in the past two announcements with GM and Ford, both CEOs essentially kind of kissing the ring, legitimizing Tesla and what they're doing. I think this is the first time you're really seeing something of this magnitude, legacy, the two biggest ones in America really coming to Twitter space and congratulating Elon and saying, please give us access to your charging infrastructure. And Elon saying, sure, come on in, you're all welcome. And by the way, I also have software. So there is a shift also in a lot of folks kind of looked at Tesla as if they were Apple, like a kind of walled garden. That was always kind of the perspective. But now Elon is flat out saying, no, we're Android. We want to open up everything to the world. Now, of course, what does that actually mean? Well, it means software. And if you look at FSD, as you pointed out, Tesla has the most miles on the road in terms of level 2+, what they call FSD, which it's really a level 2+. And they've taken, I think, the right approach to do this, which is eyes on the road, but hands off the wheel. And this was a smart decision to do, to focus on artillery roads and, driving in urban conditions. Whereas a lot of the other automakers, I know to be Mercedes, BMW, some of the premium guys are focused on level 3 with the thinking that consumers will want to watch a movie while they're driving. Oh, by the way, it's only going to be regulatorily approved under 40 miles an hour and only on highways, and you can't go on side streets. It winds up being highly impractical to use, but a nice marketing gimmick. Whereas Tesla said, no, you're going to have to look at the road, but you're not going to have to drive the car. And at any speed. So taking that decision, I think, is wound up being the smarter one, and one that I think consumers will want. And the other thing is, it's going to save lives. It's going to stop accidents. And I think that's what's going to cause regulators to get behind. I know there's a lot of friction right now with FSD from regulators, but I think as it improves and gets to a critical point where it is undeniable that it's stopping accidents and saving lives, regulators will mandate that some sort of level 2+ solution is required to be on the road, just like the rear view camera was, right? Wound up being mandatory. I think you'll have level 2+ software be mandatory. Tesla has this leading software that's out there. It's proven that it can provide a service to another automaker. That usually doesn't happen. Usually automakers don't help out each other. They usually get stuff from suppliers. That's why the supplier industry exists. But here in this case, they're clearly showing that they're open to giving up stuff to their competitors. But by doing so, I've run the math. It is highly profitable to license a software, way more than it is to make a car.
Sure. The industry has never had the greatest profit margins when it comes to each vehicle, especially vehicles that cost very, very little. In your recent report, you identified that while the $25,000, and we've been calling it the Model 2, even though there is no official name for the upcoming vehicle, but the $25,000 Tesla, which might end up being more expensive when they finally make it, probably won't have a very large profit margin to it at all. But that by building so many, I think Elon had said 5 million units per year, which is, I'm a little skeptical of that number, but it doesn't hurt to shoot for the moon. How can they really capitalize on something that on the surface seems like a loss leader, essentially, which I don't know that Tesla needs to do that, or if that would be in the best interest of the company? What is something that maybe from the surface people might miss when they're looking
Sure.
at that.
Sure. And this is such a critical question. So in my modeling, I'm not modeling them doing 5 million of these. I'm modeling them doing 3 million of these, and not for a very long time. And so they had 3 million of these, and then the rest of the cars are mostly Model 3 and Model Y, have them doing about, 2 million of those, which is not that aggressive. They're already going to be at 1.8 this year.
Right.
Million. So I think there'll be some cannibalization, meaning some folks who want a Model 3 who may go for a Model 2. Fine. So 3 million of those things. And I'm modeling those 3 million Model 2s, zero profit. And still, I'm getting from operating margins of today, it's around 18%, going to 30%. How is that math possible?
Right.
Well, it's because of software. It's because of FSD specifically, which my math shows they could charge $50 a month, which I think is very reasonable. We pay $50 a month for high-speed data in our house.
Sure.
And guess what penetration in the US is? 80 to 90%. Now, is it as much of a utility as high-speed data? Well, if the government mandates that all cars have to have it, and it certainly is. So I think $50 a month is very reasonable. And guess what software profit margins are? They're not like 10% margins like autos are. They're 90% margins. Right. So like almost all of that $50 per month goes to Tesla. They just had to develop the software once and do some, minor updates and whatnot, like some R&D here and there. But for the most part, it is all gravy. And if they get the penetration levels that I think they could get on FSA, it'll take a little time, but I think they'll get really high penetration levels at that price point. You go from their 18% gross profit margins today, going all the way up to over 30% by like 2035 is what I have. And that makes it a lot more profitable. It's really because of this FSD software, and also not only in their cars, but also their ability to license it to other cars.
It seems like, at least from the way you phrased that the future of Tesla is married to the success or failure of FSD.
In the near term, in the next like 10 years, yes, absolutely. And then I think there's an evolution of FSD, which is Robo-Taxi, which we can talk about also, is really the future of the company. So kind of the next 10 years, 10 to 15 years, it's FSD. Absolutely. That's where the company is completely headed. And then after that, after 2035 to like 2050, it's Robo-Taxi. That's really the future.
You're a lot more optimistic about autonomy and full self-driving. And in full disclosure to the audience, I have 1 hour of experience driving FSD. So my perspective is somewhat limited, but I think there's value to that because the general population has had zero experience with FSD. And that includes policymakers and like politicians and other people that are very vocal, a number of them against FSD, because of course, anytime there's a problem or an accident when somebody was using autopilot or full self-driving, boy, that makes, goes viral, makes the news, where any other car company or, that might have an accident happen while using their autonomous features, it doesn't. So I recognize that aspect can influence the public perception about the software features. In my experience with FSD, I found that it got the job done, but it was very different from the way a human would have done it. So that I've found that I have somewhat of a skeptical position when it comes to FSD. One, because I think it's named completely wrong. It's not going to drive for you per se. Like, you are still responsible for keeping, like you were saying, your eyes on the road, hands ready to take over at any point, which in just the hour that I was using it, there were a couple times where I absolutely had to intervene because I was worried about either damage to the vehicle I was driving or to other things around me. So I look at that and I'm going, I see what they're trying to do. I recognize that they have gone a long way from, even just a few years ago. It's really improved significantly. And I talk to a lot of people that have much better experiences than I do that are just raving about it. So I have to take that into consideration, of course. but I don't know how much this is going to be adopted. And I don't know the exact rate of Tesla vehicles on the road and those that are currently subscribed or have paid for the full, what is it, $15,500 or $16,000 at this point for FSD. I don't know. Maybe you're seeing something that I'm not, just in the experience that you have talking with people that I'm sure probably are able to reveal a little bit more to you. But I really am very skeptical of how many people are going to adopt FSD. Because right now it's $200 a month. I'll be honest with you, at $50 a month, I think I would probably spend that just to get more experience with it. So there's obviously a little bit of a gap there. At $200 a month, I don't know how many people would say that's something that they want to have on their car. So maybe you can kind of speak to that a little bit, and then if you can make the connection between where they are now at $200 a month and potentially offering that for less, that would be enlightening as well.
Yeah, no, they're actually very open about the fact that pricing will fall. $200 a month. I think the attached rate is only like 5% of Teslas on the road. So it's very low. So that's also part of the problem, as you pointed out. There's not enough people with experience with the product. The other thing I would say is I look at it in two ways. One is relative to the peer group. Relative to, and I've test driven everything as part of my job, right? Did Blue Cruise recently at the Ford event in Detroit. I've done the Mercedes and their San Diego event. I did, I'm going to do BMW in 2 weeks. And I've done a bunch of these products. And I would say this one's by far and away, it's not without its hiccups, but like, the average commute speed in Western Europe is 6 miles an hour. If you include idling and traffic and stoplights, most driving is a hellish nightmare for most people. It's not driving around on the windy roads of the Swiss Alps like you see in commercials, right? It's awful. And that part of the job, the FSD does perfectly. It's not that difficult. Most driving is not difficult. It's just annoying and it's boring. And what FSD does is it takes that boring, annoying, tedious part of stop and go and focus and not focus, focus and not focus, where you're kind of half participating in the process, and now takes that away from you. And that if that's $50 a month, I actually think a lot of people would get that product. The second thing I would note is we're also comparing it today, how it is. We have to realize where this is headed and how quickly it's advanced. My understanding of how this works is it's just a function of data, right? It's machine learning, there's AI.
Sure.
More data you have, the better mapping you have, the more time, the product gets better. And the other cool thing, and Elon talked about it at the Capital Markets Day in March, is it's kind of like asymptotic or geometrically multiply, right? Like the more you get, the more you get. And then it, so there will be a point, I don't know when, where it'll just like a flip of a switch. It will be such a great product and it'll be undeniable for regulators that they will actually have to mandate it. I think I really strongly believe that. Obviously we're not there right now. But every year, 20, 30 million people die in car crashes globally.
Right.
There's 100 million people impacted by hospitalized by. I mean, the numbers of this, and that it saves, like not only lives but insurance industry. So many industries are affected by this that I think it would be undeniable. Once we get to that point, the government will just basically mandate it. And I don't think $50 a month is that much for safety, for convenience. How many people take Ubers that cost way more on a per mile basis than owning a car, just to avoid the headache of dealing with all that with driving?
Sure. That is an excellent point. And I hadn't tied the just basic use of transportation to the vehicle ownership segment. And certainly where I see a lot of opportunity is for people that either do not own a vehicle or do not want to own a vehicle or cannot own a vehicle, but still need access for reliable, safe transportation. And I completely agree with you that this space is not, it's not a linear improvement. I mean, it is absolutely exponential. And what has happened in the last 5 years has accelerated faster than I have anticipated. I mean, things are moving so quickly, and that process is getting much more significant. I mean, what 5 years from now looks like is going to be vastly different from now than the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I see where you're coming from for that, where you're looking really kind of towards the future going, all right, look, we're not there now, but that you expect that we absolutely will be. When it comes to the electric vehicle world, I always tell people that when they're asking questions about timing here in the States, like when do we think we're going to do this or that or whatever? Generally, I tell them, okay, look at Europe. They're about 4 to 5 years ahead of us in terms of their policy making. With individual cities, I believe London and Paris as two have actually said by 2035, they don't want any internal combustion engine vehicles in the city limits, with a few exceptions for like commercial trucks and various things. I'm getting the impression that you believe that private vehicles will at some point be prohibited in certain areas, whether that be city centers or maybe even beyond that. What is your expectation as to when we might see that occurring? Is there any indication, if we look to Europe, that is starting to happen? Or, for those of us here in the States, what should we be expecting?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing that happen. I also spent part of my year in London. I mean, Oxford Street, which is like their big thoroughfare with all the shops and everything. The only cars that are allowed to be on Oxford streets are the black cabs and buses. You're not allowed to drive a private car on that street. And that's been the rule for a while now. There's places, I think in the Netherlands, their entire city areas where cars are not allowed, where streets were converted into just bicycle paths and restaurants and so this is definitely not unheard of. It's already there in Europe. China is talking about that aggressively, about certain cities just completely being built where cars are just not a part of, or private cars at least are not a part of that kind of ecosystem. So I will say that, like, in terms of electrification, part of the reason why Europe and China kind of went ahead with it before the US is it's also economics, right? I mean, these areas are net importers of fossil fuels.
Sure.
And I can tell you from renting cars in Europe, it is not pleasant to pay those prices at the pump. And in the US, we're fortunate to be net exporters of this stuff. And also we tend to drive longer distances. So the switch to electrification, as you pointed out, I think that's a good time horizon that you said, about 5 years is how behind I guess we are. And that's perfectly fine. But we can't deny where everything is headed. These vehicles, we know the TCO, total cost of ownership argument, they save money. They're also just better products, right? Better acceleration, a better driving experience. And, Americans love performance. The Europeans are kind of forcing it down everybody's throat because of CO2 compliance and because of economics. Here in the US, it's about performance. That's what we care about. Well, guess what? EVs have better performance.
Yep.
So I think you're right. I think we're about 5 years delayed, but it's inevitable. And we're already seeing it happen, especially in urban areas and cities. Will private cars be banned? I do think in some cities, you could definitely see it. New York City, absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't see any reason. I think that's already been discussed. Certainly, maybe, I don't know if the entire Manhattan, but certainly portions of Manhattan, it totally makes sense. Also, remember, one of the big crises we're seeing in America is as our big cities are having huge housing crisis, right? It's impossible. Pricing is it's putting people out of homes, and then people can't build new homes because of zoning laws, and people who existing homeowners aren't allowing homes to be built. Well, if you get rid of cars or a lot of private cars, you save up 1/3 of city spaces. A lot of cars are in parking garages. If you can take that out, you save a lot of city space. So I think it's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's going to probably start in Europe and in China. And I think big cities in the US are going to adopt it. And it's only going to have positive implications.
Sure. I mean, the benefits from even electric vehicles being removed from the cities, from safety, from just aesthetics. I mean, if we went back and completely redesigned the cities that we lived in, kind of the way Tesla approaches things, just blank sheet of paper, what would we want them to look like? And maybe it's my experience with SimCity, growing up as a kid, but I actually always hated traffic, and I hate it now as an adult in real life. Like, my wife she loves Washington, D.C. Like, that is where she just feels at home with her heart. I hate Washington, D.C. traffic. I love so much about Northern Virginia and D.C. in that area, but you can be, stuck for a very long time. I mean, D.C. from Richmond, where I am, without traffic, maybe 2 hours, hour and a half. There are times where that could easily be 5 hours because of just the amount of congestion. So I think there's a lot of benefit to that. People will still need to get around. So aside from public transportation, your buses, your cabs, your rail transit, let's get into talking about the potential for robo-taxis, or fully autonomous vehicles that you basically can summon it like you would now with an Uber. Maybe you have an app and you say, hey, I need a car. A car will pull up, you'll get into it. It will drive you to your destination. You get out, and then it goes on and handles the next request. That would require, at the very least, level 4 autonomy. Level 5, I've always been skeptical of, and we don't need to get into, all of that because I've talked about it before on the podcast. So to get from level 2 plus, and like you were mentioning, Mercedes has been starting to kind of work with level 3, although it's extremely limited. I've always viewed level 3 autonomy as being the most dangerous point, that we actually need to skip to level 4 so that people do not need to respond if there is an issue with the vehicle. Because, to your point, people aren't going to be paying attention. So then suddenly, if something happens and the car goes, hey, you need to pay attention. Well, if I'm watching a movie or reading a book or even maybe taking a nap, and now, boom, I have to pay attention to, I got to first figure out what it's asking me to pay attention to, which that's valuable time. And who knows what accidents could happen in that time. And I think, honestly, that's one of the biggest issues with the current full self-driving and autopilot that Tesla offers, is the human element, that people are using it incorrectly. People are not paying attention. They're not remembering that they are the one that is still driving the vehicle, and therefore accidents happen. But yet the driver doesn't get blamed. The software gets blamed. That I see being a significant drawback in terms of policymakers getting the information that they need, because they're going to be inundated with so many different reports and everything. And it's human nature to just be lazy about it, where you're just going to, hey, if something's on the news, oh, well, that's the truth. That must be what's actually happening. In terms of timeline, and then also potentially what would need to be done, can you talk a little bit about what you think that will look like to transition from where we are now with a very advanced level 2 to get to level 4, which I do think that's what will be needed in order for any kind of robo-taxi from any company to really be what is going to work.
Yeah, no, I think the way you described it, going from level 2 plus to 4, is how Tesla wants to do it. They don't actually believe in level 3. You're exactly right. The one exception I've heard is some folks have thought about maybe they could be, folks in a building somewhere, like a video game, who would step in and help you drive your car or something. That would be so expensive, though.
I recently talked with a company that is offering that right now. So that is a stepping stone.
Yeah, I feel like that'd be very expensive, and that also feels a little dangerous because what if there's a problem like a storm or something, it's happening at once, and there's not enough folks that can do it, and I don't know. It's just to me, I think I agree with your initial point of level 2 plus, where you have to look at outside and see what's happening, and you don't necessarily have to hold the steering wheel. You can kind of just, I mean, a lot of us in the 90s used to do that anyway. While we're like eating a sandwich while we're driving. And
oh yeah.
Yeah. So I mean,
I've got my stories too.
So I mean, like, I think, going from 2 to 4, and I agree with you, 5 is sci-fi. It's unnecessary anyway. 5 just means that the car is like almost sentient. It just does, it can take you wherever you want to go, even though it doesn't even know where you're going. Don't worry about that. So, but 4 is really all you need for robo-taxis. Now, I do agree with you. That is far away. Absolutely. There's a lot of hurdles to get over. Specifically, it's urban areas. Like some cities, it actually can work. I could say we already have some Robotaxi, obviously, in San Francisco. You have Cruise and Waymo, I think, in Phoenix. I think Austin. Yep. I've been hearing about Miami as a potential location. So like very specific areas and places that it can work. Now, will that work in Mumbai? Not for a very long time, right? So it really depends on the test case and example. But I do think, similar to FSD, it will be kind of an asymptotic event. And when it does come, the tech at least, it will just come like so quickly.
When do you think that's going to happen?
My modeling and also conversations with folks in the industry, LiDAR manufacturers, chip makers, etc., suggest that the time frame that we should be thinking about for robotaxi ubiquity in the developed world, that's like the US, Western Europe, China, is more like 2035. And that's being conservative because there's some who think it's going to be the end of the decade. I think this kind of stuff always takes longer, right? So I think the tech will get there by the end of the decade, but regulatory, that will take time. And I think that's more likely to be 2035 event.
2035, really? That seems very optimistic. The date that I would have put on it would have been closer to 2045, maybe even 2050. It's funny. I have a very optimistic view when it comes to the advancement of technology, and somewhat of a pessimistic view when I look at humanity as a whole, where we can have the best technology, but humans will always mess it up.
Right.
So I kind of expect that the timeline will be slower, like you were saying, in terms of being able to adopt the technology, even though the technology itself might be ready. So I guess at this point, it really is just a matter of when, how much it will cost, and then what the public reception will be for any of these technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or fully autonomous vehicles that are electric. I don't know. I think 2035 may be optimistic, even though it is only 12 years away. A lot could happen in 12 years.
Look what's happened in the past 12 years.
Well, yeah. I mean, shoot, when you look back, you're like, oh my goodness, like the world 12 years ago, where we are now would be completely unrecognizable. So I'll give you that. And I think I'll just pause and step back maybe for a little bit from my position of being so skeptical, because, what do I know? I'm just a guy in his basement talking to a computer. Like, there's certainly a lot going on.
No, I think you're actually the consensus opinion is actually what you're saying. Most of the pushback I've gotten from my report is this, that this is actually farther out, and it's because of how cities are built. The grid system would have to be completely redone, and some of these cities are ancient, and the logistics behind this is 2035 is far too early, and that could be right. I do have to just note a couple of things. One, Elon's definitely a person who has changed his mind, so I could totally see him putting radar back in and potentially even LiDAR. I just don't see why he couldn't change it, especially if it makes the product better. The other thing is, a lot of the edge cases are caused, I think, because of we're in this intermediary part, which is actually robotaxis may actually make stuff harder, right? Like you've heard of the cruise incidents in SF where it blocks emergency vehicles. And so the problem is you have autonomous vehicles driving alongside human-driven vehicles and bicycles and this and that. Like, it's a mess right now. But, I think like the more robotaxis on the road, the more private cars start getting banned. So there's a lot that needs to be done. But I think this stuff can be done in the next 13 years. This is stuff that can definitely happen. It's just we need to ban certain cars on certain streets. We need to get more robotaxis on the road that can communicate with each other. Use V2X where they communicate with traffic lights, etc. Use the cloud better. That all can happen in 13 years. But even if it doesn't, my analysis on the robotaxi industry and how profitable it could be, this is multiple trillions of dollars of value because it's just more efficient to utilize these things. They do more miles per year, and the cost of a robotaxi by 2035 will drop from like 100,000 per car or vehicle, drop down to like 50,000. And the cost per mile goes to like 30 cents because you've eliminated the driver also, compared to a private car, which is like 50 cents. And people are willing to pay $1.75 per mile with an Uber. Imagine what the profitability is. Even you slash that to 90 cents, which is what I use my model. And maybe it's not 2035, maybe it's 2040, right? My modeling goes out to 2050. And so maybe I'm off by another 5 years. At the end of the day, the order of magnitude, we're dealing with such crazy numbers that it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Maybe it happens a little later, but I think these types of issues just get resolved through inertia.
Sure.
And just getting more of these things on the road and regulators getting on board. That's absolutely critical. Partnership of regulators and the industry will make this happen.
Sure. I agree. I think it's inevitable. Part of my heart sinks when I'm looking very selfishly at just myself because I love driving. Generally, I mean, traffic, nobody really likes that. But, aside from that, so I'm always going to be one of the guys that's like, no. I want my car that I can still drive. And so I'm going to be this like old cranky man that's like, oh, these self-driving vehicles. Like back in my day, we could do it all ourselves. The benefits are undeniable. And I think to the greater community, that has to be the focus. We have to take steps that improve the quality of life for all of us, not just on an individual by individual basis. I know we're running into time, so I want to actually ask you one last question with the expectation, and let's call it 20 years from now. Okay, so 2043, we are now going to have maybe a good majority of major cities in the developed world are now saying private vehicle ownership is not allowed. At that point, robo-taxis are going to be here, hypothetically. If we don't need people to be buying cars, we're going to need a lot less cars on the road. So there's this with Tesla saying that they want to be selling, 20 million vehicles per year. That is a big, big number. So if we even assume that we get close to that, because I do think that's pretty optimistic too. What I think is not being talked about enough is that there will be a lot of consolidation of auto manufacturers and a lot that probably will go out of business because they either haven't moved quick enough or their business model is entirely dependent on selling to private ownership. And if private ownership is reduced significantly, where does that leave the auto industry? And then I'm going to ask you to do this, and maybe you can't, and that's perfectly okay. But are you able at this point to even hypothesize who the winners and losers might be in the next 20 years?
Sure. I wrote a report on this exact topic last year. And I actually am a big believer that what you've described is where the world is going to head. And it has huge implications on the auto industries. And the 20 million number from Tesla, I think it's a stretch number. I think even if you really talk to them, they would tell you that. There's only 90 million cars sold a year anyway, right? And 20 million would automatically put a ton of companies out of business, right? It's these profit margins for cars is only like 9-10% anyway. So imagine when the market share, the break-even point is lost. So I only have Tesla selling 5 to 6 million cars a year. And I think that's really all you need. But you're absolutely right. Look, one Robo-Taxi takes out 5 private cars in terms of utilization. So you could just do the math there and you could see how many cars will be taken off the road. So what does that mean for the auto industry? Certainly, you don't need all these brands, right? When's the last time you cared what Uber picked you up? You don't care, right? So I do see brands going away. Stellantis has 13 brands. Do they need all of them in this world? No. Maybe it just narrows down to a select few. And all these auto companies, I think brands go away and they consolidate into smaller brands and they sell less cars. So that means they're going to have to merge with each other, right? You've already seen some of that happen even to this day. I mean, Fiat merging with Peugeot to form Stellantis. And there's going to be, the implications of that is going to be brands are going to get cut. Maybe it's Chrysler, Dodge, Abarth, a bunch of brands like that. I can see that happening with, let's say Ford and VW merged together, which has been talked about a lot. A lot of those like models and brands go away and production will start coming down. And then these large auto conglomerates, which will form, you don't need 30 automakers in that world.
Right.
Maybe that'll come down to like a handful. They will now be able to scale and provide Robo-Taxi services. They'll make their own fleet of these vehicles, maybe similar to Origin, which is what GM makes for Cruise. What Tesla is going to be a part of this, making their purpose-built vehicles. Maybe these large conglomerates of, let's say it's VW and Ford, and maybe somebody else combines with them. They'll all effectively become fleet operators. They'll either own and operate their own fleets, or in the case of Renault, they've already talked about they'll make the actual vehicle and sell it to fleet operators.
Sure.
So I think that's what will happen. Consolidation, much fewer cars will be made, but they'll become either providers of the vehicle to service operators, or they themselves will be service operators. What this definitely means, and I do think it's bad news for, is suppliers who makes, let's say, seats and windshield wipers and interiors and these sorts of things. They're going to have to really pivot to a different business model entirely, maybe become more software angled, maybe more tech angled. But quite honestly, I actually don't know what happens to these businesses. I think they're looking at this and saying, this is so far away. We're not going to think about it. But unfortunately for these businesses, they're going to have to consolidate themselves. But fewer cars means fewer seats and windshield wipers.
Sure.
There's no way around that. But I do think there'll be winners here too, notably someone like a Tesla, folks making the software. There are suppliers who do that, right? Mobileye is a great example of this. They're going to be huge winners of this development. Google with Waymo, maybe Apple gets involved here. So there'll definitely be winners. And maybe Uber, by example, I talk about it in my most recent note. They may wind up being the back end. So like, let's say Tesla has their service, their Robotaxi service. Maybe they do a revenue share. So when you ride this Robotaxi, maybe you do it through your Uber app, which you already had, and Uber gets a cut of the fare. And that's just all margin for them. So it doesn't have to be a big cut. Maybe they get 10-15%. And then Tesla gets the rest of it. So I see more the technologically bent companies participating here, benefiting. I see a lot of consolidation, but I see a lot of folks who are just making parts of cars. That, unfortunately, I do think could suffer.
Awesome. Well, Tom, I want to thank you for joining me and for your time. We've covered a lot. If somebody wants to expand on anything that we've talked about and kind of dive into some of the reports and things that you've put out there, what is the best way for them to find any of those? Like, is there a place that they can go, like a website or something that they can just kind of search for what they might be looking for?
Yeah, of course we're an investment bank, so a lot of our research is subscription based. But I will say there is a lot of media that we do have. You can check out our website, our RBC Royal Bank of Canada, and also but I would say check out my LinkedIn, and just stay tuned. Watch CNBC, Bloomberg TV.
Yep.
You're sure to see me there.
Yeah, or I've been watching a lot of Yahoo Finance.
Finance.
Yep,
Yes.
they'll have you on too. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and end it. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me and share about all of this with the EV Resource audience.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Zach.
And I want to thank all of you who have listened to this episode. If you want to see Tom's most recent report on Tesla's autonomous future, and even the report he mentioned that was published last year on the development of autonomous vehicles, I have both PDF files published publicly on the EV Resource Patreon page. So you can find that at patreon.com/EVResource. Because it's public, you do not have to be a current Patreon supporter in order to have access to it. So definitely make sure you go and check those out. The question of the week segment and EV Resource Hotline, I'm going to skip for this episode in the interest of time, but I'm going to have that return next episode, number 157, which will be a recap of the news from this week. And then soon after that, hopefully within the next couple of days, I'll have episode 158 published. That's going to be a conversation that I had earlier this year with the solar car team at Virginia Tech. Also, I want to remind you to keep an eye on the YouTube channel and definitely subscribe if you haven't already. I am almost finished editing a video from this past winter of the 70-mile-an-hour range test that I did with a Texas-built Model Y long range. That should be finished very soon. And then I've got a few other exciting videos to edit as well that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you all, including my highway range test and performance tests of the Nissan Ariya that I had, I guess it's been about a month for a few days. And if you haven't already, make sure you sign up to receive the EV Resource Weekly newsletter and bi-monthly digital magazine. Both are free and get delivered directly to your email inbox. You can find the link to that in the show notes. I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. At the director tier, currently the top tier available, we have Rajiv Narayan, Andy Cooper, and Ethan B. And at the executive producer tier is our friend Christopher Lawrence. I will include much more information about Patreon and some of the other ways that you can support the podcast, should you choose. I'll share all about that in the next episode. So that'll end it for this one. Thank you so much for being with me, and I will catch you real soon to recap the news from this week.